quiet room, the dark history of lobotomies, and the cures for the unworthy. It began with fear, long before the white coats and bright lamps, before the hum of electricity and the gleam of steel. There was only the terror of the mind unbound. Those who heard voices were thought to consort with spirits. Those who drifted into melancholy were touched by sin. In every century, madness was seen not as suffering, but as contagion, something that was hidden, punished, or purged. By the 17th century, the afflicted were cast in almshouses and workhouses, locked beside criminals and the dying. The walls were damp, the air a broth of rot and despair. Chains clanked against stone as the mad cried into the dark, unheard. They called these places houses of correction. But correction was another word for containment. When the Enlightenment came, it promised reason, yet reason brought its own cruelty. Physicians spoke of science, not sin, of treatment, not torture. But the methods differed little. They strapped patients to chairs that spun until the world disappeared in dizziness. They blistered the skin to release humors. They bled the restless until their hearts slowed. Pain was proof of progress. In the 19th century, architect itself became part of the cure. Massive asylums rose on the outskirts of every growing city. Vast stone wings arranged like crosses surrounded gardens and high walls. They called it the moral treatment. Cleanliness, routine, and isolation would restore the reason that chaos had devoured. Morning prayers, measured walks, silent meals, each act a small obedience meant to discipline the soul. But behind the facade of order lay a deeper dread. The institution swelled beyond capacity. Thousands poured in, few ever left. Attendance grew harsh, funding grew thin, and silence once more replaced understanding. The cries of the inmates echoed through the corridors that smelled of soap and fear. 1,000 windows, and everyone barred. In these halls, the modern age was born. Here doctors cataloged every trembling hand and vacant stare. They drew diagrams of skulls, measured distance between the eyes, like this fellow, convinced that madness could be mapped like geography. They believed the brain held secrets that knives might one day reveal. It was only a matter of time. By the dawn of the 20th century, optimism had turned surgical. Electricity promised control. Chemistry promised calm. and beneath the polished floors of laboratories, a new theology took root: salvation through incision. They began tiny probes, slid into the heads of animals, threads of silver and glass tracing through itself. Then came the human subjects, volunteers and not so voluntary alike, offered to science by families who could no longer bear the shame. The first operations were hesitant, almost reverent. A few millimeters here, a sliver there, the surgeon's hands trembling between miracle and murder. The results were unpredictable. Some patients quietened, others shattered. But even failure had its followers, for nothing is more seductive than a cure that silences suffering. Across Europe and America, asylums multiplied. Their chimneys smoked night and day, kitchens feeding thousands who never again saw the world beyond the gates. Reporters wrote of progress. Photographs showed orderly rows of patients, tending gardens, sewing, reading Bibles, but the lens never captured the locked rooms, the restraints, the endless experiments. What the public saw was mercy. What the wall saw was obedience. Then in Lisbon, a man named Antonio Egas Moniz drew a simple conclusion. If the mind was a circuit, its madness might be cut. In 1935, he took a wire loop, inserted it deep into the frontal lobe of the brain, and severed the connections he believed caused disorder. When the patient awoke, calm, replaced agitation, she no longer screamed, no longer cried. Moniz called it lobotomy, the white cut. The world called it triumph. Soon applause filled the jaws. Nobel committees wrote his name in gold. And few asked about the aftermath, the seizures, the blindness, the deaths. The experiment had worked well enough to feed the hunger for control. Across the ocean, another man listened. His name was Walter Freeman. He was not a surgeon by training, but he understood spectacle. He saw a Moses knife, a revelation for the masses. Why confine the cure to hospitals, he thought, when it could be brought to every doorstep in America? And so the age of the lobotomy began in earnest. Freeman's patients came from every walk of life. Housewives weary of domestic despair. Soldiers haunted by war. Children restless and defiant. He promised peace where there had been turmoil, normalcy where there had been shame. His method was faster, cleaner, easier. He traded the operating room for an office, the scalpel for an ice pick. He slipped it beneath the eyelid, tapped gently through the thin plate of bone, and a new method was discovered. He went down to town. Newspapers called him the miracle worker. His photograph showed a smiling man, spectacles, sleeves rolled, instrument poised like a pen, about to correct a mistake. The mistake of a curse was human thought itself. He called his mobile theater the lobotomobile. Within it, he performed demonstration after demonstration as though salvation could be delivered on wheels. The crowds came eagerly. Nurses, physicians, administrators, hungry for an answer that cost little and promised much. For every restless ward, every violent outburst, every sleepless patient who cried into the night, there was now a solution that took less than 10 minutes. The first tap broke through the bone with a delicate crack, almost musical. The second tap swept away the storms that haunted the mind. A twist of the wrist, a smile for the audience, and the patient was reborn. At least, that was the story told from the podium. In truth, the rebirth was a kind of burial. The lights behind the eyes dimmed. The will dissolved like salt in water. They sat still, docile, pliant. The doctors called it serenity. The attendants called it a blessing. The families, desperate for peace, accepted it. And so the procession continued. From 1946 to 1955, the ice pick crossed more than 3,000 foreheads. Freeman kept meticulous notes, pages filled with phrases like improved, manageable, content. When questioned, he spoke of compassion. He said he was freeing people from pain. But pain is the language of the living, and silence is the dialect of the dead. Hospitals competed to host his demonstrations. In auditoriums that smelled of ether and chalk, students watched him perform on stage. A nurse held the patient's head. Freeman leaned close, the instrument flashing under the lights, and the crowd held its breath. In that hush, something ancient stirred. The same awe that once greeted exorcisms and miracles. Here, science had become ritual. Outside the theaters, the asylums overflowed. Tens of thousands languished inwards, too narrow for walking. The walls peeled. The ceilings leaked. There were not enough doctors, not enough attendants. The lobotomy promised release, not only for the patient, but for the system itself. It turned chaos into compliance. It made the unmanageable manageable. It made the unwanted invisible. In West Virginia, whole hospitals devoted wings to the practice. In the Midwest, small town physicians copied the technique with kitchen tools. One boasted of being the most progressive in the nation. Hundreds operated upon the order restored. But few asked what became of the voices that once filled those rooms. Among them was Rosemary Kennedy, whose bright laughter had once filled Boston drawing rooms. After her operation, the laughter vanished. She moved slowly, spoke rarely, and spent the rest of her life in a convent, the sun catching her face through stained glass. Newspapers called it a family tragedy. The doctors called it success. Howard Dooley was 12. His stepmother described him as defiant. Freeman described him as suitable. The boy lay still beneath the doctor's hands, his eyelid pulled upward, the instrument polished and poised. Years later, he would recall the sound, a dull crack inside his skull, like ice breaking on a river. When he awoke, the world felt flat, the sky smaller. He could not cry. He could not dream. There were thousands like him whose names never reached print. Children who misbehaved, women who wept, veterans who drank. For them, the operation was not a last resort, but a convenience. In some hospitals, it was offered before therapy, before medicine even, before mercy, because it was faster, cleaner, quieter. Inside the wards, the change was unmistakable. The shouting stopped. Restraints loosened. Order returned. And administrators praised the miracle. Photographers visited to capture the calm. Rows of patients smiling faintly at the camera. Their eyes glassy and distant. Progress, they said, had finally come to psychiatry. Yet beneath the surface, something began to stir. A handful of doctors, uneasy, started to question the gospel. They saw the drooling mouths, the vacant stares, the lives reduced to breathing statues. They spoke in cautious tones, publishing reports of side effects, seizures, paralysis, and death. Their words were buried under applause. It took time and scandal to break the spell. Freeman's confidence became hubris. He performed more, faster, rougher. In one demonstration, his pick slipped, a patient bled and died before the audience could rise from their seats. Still he continued. His own hospital finally barred him. After another death, a woman who had already undergone the procedure twice. The third meant to perfect her peace. It perfected her silence. The newspapers turned. The word butchery appeared. Where miracle had once been, families sued. Survivors spoke of confusion, of memories torn from them, of emotions that would never return. Still, the asylums hummed. New treatments arrived. The shock machine, the insulin coma, the endless rotation of trials and hope. Each new promise smelled faintly of the old one. Each sought to tame the same mystery, the human mind. They refused to fit. Outside, the century turned again. The public began to see photographs from inside the hospitals. Corridors lined with motionless figures. Wards overflowing. Attendance outnumbered 10 to 1. The dream of reform curdled into horror. Words like warehousing replaced care. Politicians called for closure. The institutions began to crumble. When the 1960s arrived, the great hospitals were already fraying. The paint peeling from the ceilings, plaster cracking, and slow spider webs. Rain gathered in buckets set along the halls. Administrators spoke of the budgets and overcrowding. Politicians spoke of dignity and reform. Cameras were finally allowed inside, and what the world saw could not be unseen. Television crews filmed patients swaying in endless corridors, half-clothed, unattended. The miracle of modern psychiatry looked suddenly ancient. The public gasped. And the same governments that had once built these places of mercy now ordered them undone. The doors were thrown open. Thousands poured into a world that had forgotten their names. They wandered city streets, carrying sacks of medication, ghosts among the living. The era of the institution ended not with justice, but with exhaustion. In its place rose a new faith, the chemistry of the mind. The pill replaced the blade. Doctors who once praised the ice pick now praised chlorpromazine and lithium. The vocabulary changed, but the ambition did not. To make the difficult manageable, to hush what could not be understood. Inside the clinics, the quiet deepened. The same serenity that had once forced by steel was now coaxed by powder. Families no longer signed surgical consent. They filled prescriptions. The hands of silence were gentler, but their purpose remained familiar. The unruly were calmed, the sad made still, the anxious subdued, and society congratulated itself on its mercy. A few voices tried to remind the world, in hearings and articles, survivors of the old procedures spoke. They described a brightness lost, emotions blunted, memories blurred. Their stories sounded unbelievable, like fables from another age. Audiences shuddered, then changed the channel. Progress had already written its next chapter. By the 1970s, the word lobotomy had become a relic, something whispered with embarrassment by younger physicians, and hospitals removed it from their brochures. Textbooks reduced it to a footnote. The ice picks were boxed away, the photographs filed in archives. Yet for all the attempts to bury the past, the results could not be undone. Entire generations lived out their days in the afterglow of surgical mercy. Nursing homes, convents, and state facilities housed them quietly until death. Those hospitals now stand as monuments of dust. Trees push through their courtyards. Ivy swallows their windows. The wind moves through empty wards like breath through a throat. Visitors speak of hearing footsteps, of the faint rattle of trolleys long removed. But these are not hauntings. They are memory itself, repeating the sounds that history tried to erase. The ghostly historian sees them all. The attendants scrubbing floors in silence. The doctors writing numbers in neat columns. The patients staring at their reflections in polished handles of their spoons. Each believes they are doing what must be done. Each believes the world will thank them. And above them all, the persistent, seductive, that suffering can be tidied away. When the century turned again, the language softened once more. No one spoke of madness. They spoke of disorder. No one confined the ill. They treated them in the community. Yet the urge remained to medicate every tremor of difference, to draw borders around acceptable thought. The hospitals may be gone, but the rooms have multiplied. Smaller now, brighter, disguised as safety. The historian walks through them, unseen. Past polished floors of modern clinics, the quiet hum of machines, the polite conversation between doctor and patient. The same promises spoken in new words. We will make you better. And the same trade is offered: freedom for peace, filling for calm. He pauses where the corridors narrow, where the lights flicker. In that fragile hum, he can still hear the faint echo of the old instruments. The soft tap against still bone, the sigh that followed. It is only imagination, perhaps. Or perhaps history itself is refusing to die. What the world forgets, the walls remember. They remember Rosemary's laughter, Howard's bewildered gaze, the countless nameless who slipped from rage to vacancy in the space of a heartbeat. They remember the applause, the awards, the speeches about progress. They remember the silence that the walls are pale, the bed neatly made, no straps, no stains, only the hum of air through vents. It could be any hospital, any clinic, any century. Someone will sit there soon, seeking peace. A voice will promise help. A needle will whisper into a vein. and the silence will begin again. The lobotomy did not end. It changed its form. The instruments are cleaner, their words softer, their faces kinder, but the purpose? To make them bearable and visible endures. And so the quiet room waits. Silently. Hauntingly. It waits.